Hi, I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome to the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. Today's episode brings you a conversation with someone who's had a front row seat to some of the most consequential shifts in Middle East diplomacy over the last decade, Jason Greenblatt. He served as the White House Special Representative for International Negotiations under President Donald Trump in his first term in office and was one of the chief architects of the Abraham Accords, the historic normalization agreements between Israel, the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco. He's also the author of the book In the Path of Abraham, which offers a rare inside look at how these deals came together and what it takes to try to reshape an entire region's political landscape. Jason joined us to talk about where things stand now in the region. We dig into what he thinks the administration is getting right and wrong in its efforts to broker a new ceasefire deal with Hamas. He shares his view on how the war has changed the regional dynamics, especially when it comes to the long discussed possibility of normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Is it still possible? And what would it take to get us there? We also look ahead. If talks were to begin between Donald Trump and Iran, what would it look like? And could this lead to a clash between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu? And also, are the Abraham Accords in a 2.0 version back on the table? And what lessons has the U.S., if any, learned from its past efforts? Jason doesn't pull punches. He speaks candidly from experience and with the clarity of someone who really knows what he's talking about. So whether you agree with his politics or not, it's a perspective worth listening to. Here we go. Jason Greenblatt, it's great to have you on the JPPI podcast. Thank you so much for joining me.
Great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. So we're talking because I really wanted to try to tap into your knowledge, experience, and lots of experience here in the region, particularly now as the Trump administration continues to try to broker a new deal and ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. Lots of conflicting reports of when that might happen, how that would happen, what it would look like, how many prisoners might be released. And Steve Witkoff, the president's special envoy for the Middle East, who's got his hand in a lot of different pots at the same time with the Russia-Ukraine issue, of course, that war and the talks there, but definitely with what's going on here in close to home in Israel with Gaza. But how do you evaluate, if I might just ask you, where things stand from the Trump view? Because one thing that does seem very clear here is, unlike the Biden administration, there's currently no daylight, at least that's how it looks to me, between Trump and the Netanyahu government. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on how you view that current standing.
Sure. Look, a lot to unpack there. And by the way, I used to compliment a lot of what President Biden did from October 7. I think he made a lot of mistakes, but through and through, he was very helpful to Israel. But, I have to admit, Trump and Steve Witkoff and everybody else are so much better. And there is no daylight, and they have, really, really strong joint thoughts in terms of how to tackle everything. I hope it'll be the same with Iran. Maybe we'll get to that later in the conversation. But I think they're doing a great job. I think Steve Witkoff, nobody knew what to expect of him, the same way they didn't know what to expect of Jared or me or David Friedman, from outside of government. But what he brings to the table, very much what we brought to the table, is a deep, close relationship with President Trump, which is so important. That's not to say that, diplomats or Secretary of State don't bring important things to the table. They do, but everybody recognizes that Steve speaks for President Trump. He's very clear that when he was on Tucker Carlson in this interview, which I recommend all your listeners listen to, it was a really important interview. He's very clear that he does speak for the president. He would never say anything that the president has not told him is okay to say. And I think that he also brings this honesty and reality into the conversation, and that shines through in that Tucker Carlson interview as well. He's not a diplomat, and therefore he's diplomatic, but he's not a diplomat. And therefore he's not afraid to talk about things that, you would actually hear in the Oval Office, as I remember well for the couple of years I was at the White House, or internal meetings that you hear. He is not afraid to speak about those things out loud, and the give and take, and then the what about this in front of people. And that's how people get educated. Instead of little sound bites that the news media loves to put out, which doesn't really enlighten anyone, he's willing to have a thought process out in the open.
I mean, I'm curious, Jason, from just your kind of experience, and let me just say from the top, you wrote a great book, the In the Path of Abraham, how Donald Trump made peace in the Middle East and how to stop Joe Biden from unmaking it. Came out as Joe Biden was kind of becoming president, but you look at really the context to an extent of the real truth, I would say, about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in today's context and how it matches up in the Abraham Accords, and I mention this because the Palestinian conflict was not an impediment to the Abraham Accords back in 2020. It was able to happen, the normalization agreements with the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco. So all this was possible. And I'm curious today, as you think of where Trump is and the president and his team, if it weren't for hostages, would they, because that's a real humanitarian issue, and that's an issue that really has Israel caught up in. But if it weren't for hostages, if it was just another round of fighting between Israel and Hamas, would this be taking up the same amount of attention, resources for the administration, or would they not even be dealing with it?
I think pushing an Abraham Accords 2.0 would take up a lot of bandwidth of the administration. It's a legacy President Trump is proud of, should be proud of, should be honored for. I think the Israeli-Palestinian conflict would be less so if it wasn't for the hostages. And of course, you have to remember, still have the Houthis who are, let's call it, part and parcel of this whole equation. But even President Biden didn't want to touch the Israeli-Palestinian conflict even before October 7. I think people realize that unless and until there's a change of leadership in Ramallah, and unless and until you solve the Hamas problem, which now we absolutely have to solve, but even before October 7, anybody who knew anything, all the professionals who've been watching the space for a long time, realize that unless you solve Hamas, there is no solution for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
I'm curious, you mentioned the Tucker Carlson interview, which really was wide-ranging and touched on a lot of different issues. But I want to focus on one of the questions that Steve Witkoff was asked by Tucker regarding what's happening right now in the talks that he's trying to broker between Hamas and Israel. And there he was asked about what does Hamas want and what is a win and how can we get this war over? And he did kind of make it sound like a possible Hamas involvement in the day after Gaza is not something that's completely off the table. And he spoke about how initially people told him that Hamas is all ideologically driven. That's what it's about. He called them, he was told they're ideologically intractable, but that he doesn't find them to be that way. And for Israeli ears, that was interesting to hear because we feel, a lot of people here do at least, that we're up against this murderous, barbaric, terrorist organization that, yes, is ideologically intractable and is not someone for us to sit down and talk to. So I'm curious how you understood those comments by Steve.
Yeah. Look, I agreed with almost everything in his interview that at least I know of. I can't speak to the Russia thing because it's not my area, right? But on the Middle East, I agree wholeheartedly. That's probably the one space that I would have said differently than him. I personally believe they're ideological haters of Israel. They, yes, they had this thing where they'll go back to the 67 borders they once said, but that's just a temporary thing. They are from the river to the sea. I think there might be people telling Steve that perhaps Hamas is less ideological and can change their stripes. I don't believe that, but it's not it's the same thing as Iran, right? The president sent this letter to the Iranian leader via the UAE and wants to talk, and people have to sort of figure out, well, is it possible that Iran wants to change its stripes? Is it possible Hamas wants to change its stripes? I don't believe that. But there is this small possibility. So I think President Trump believes, and Steve Witkoff works for President Trump, if there's any possibility of solving these problems without war, through diplomacy, and maybe he could convince them, his Gaza plan or some variation thereof could actually work. And that will save Israel and save Israelis and save Palestinians who don't support Hamas. It's his obligation to at least try. Trump is a very smart guy. Steve, I don't know him personally, but seems to be a very smart guy. They'll figure out very quickly if the idea that Hamas is not ideological has any truth or not. And if it doesn't, they're going to move on and help Israel. I don't mean, with boots on the ground, but help Israel in its mission to see what they could do about removing Hamas, which we all know is, it's a tall order. I'm not sure if it's really achievable.
What do you think, when you look at this conflict that's been raging now for 18 months, has its different levels of intensity, but now Israel's back in Gaza, lots of airstrikes, troops back on the ground, and we still have 24 living hostages, 59, including bodies of hostages who are still languishing in Hamas captivity. For the Israeli, there's fatigue, obviously, here in Israeli society, within the IDF, within the reserves, but I would say even generally speaking. And it seems, though, at least for now, that this operation, or the resumption of the offensive, is really aimed at kind of getting Hamas to ease up its demands, that we can try to get a deal without having to go to what was then supposed to be stage 2, which Israel would have had to declare an end to the conflict. Do you think it's possible? And I'm curious what you would recommend if Netanyahu were to ask you, what does that day after look like? Because I think we kind of do know at this point what a lot of us, I've been saying it, others have been saying it, the military alone is not going to win the war. We do need a political resolution that comes with this. Not a peace deal, but we need something else to control Gaza. We need to put that in place. Who is that? No one's willing to say. Saudis, Emiratis, Egyptians, the Palestinian Authority. Who is that? So who do you see as potentially doing this?
So I'll say two things. I'll start with something recent, or very recent, I think yesterday, development, where you have Palestinians, for the first time, many of them protesting Hamas. Now, many out of 2 million, I don't know, is it 1,000? Is it 500? I don't know what the accurate number is. And you also have to ask yourself, what's the main question? Are they protesting because the suffering for them is so bad, they just want a reprieve, and then in a week or 2 or 10 months, they're going to just go back to hating Israel and wanting to destroy Israel? Or do these Palestinians, and maybe many more, finally realize Hamas has brought them nothing but misery and destruction, and it's time, it's over, it's not going to happen, let's figure out how to get past the conflict? So it absolutely, if I were Prime Minister Netanyahu, dig into that and see, is this sort of an Arab Spring, let's call it, with real partners among those Palestinians who actually want a better future that's different than what they were falsely promised and that involves destroying Israel? Or is it sort of this temporary thing? That's number one. Number two, and I think they should have done this a long time ago, but it's a small country busy fighting an important war, really more than one war, because look what they managed to do with Hezbollah, and look what happened in Syria, and now, of course, the Houthis. They should communicate better with their Arab partners, even those that have not signed the Abraham Accords, to figure out how we can make this work. Israelis are great negotiators, but sometimes they demand things that are just not achievable, and they have to put themselves into the shoes of MBS, of MBC, of the leader of Qatar, of the leaders of Egypt and Jordan, and say, yes, look, we want this, and this is why we need it, but we respect you too, and we understand you have your own needs. Let's figure out how we can bridge these gaps. From a lot of what I've been hearing since October 7 in the region, and I know only from the outside, so I don't know all the real truth, but from what I'm hearing, I think there needs to be better communication to figure out how to solve that problem. And those were probably the two pieces of advice I'd give him today.
Interesting. You should talk about dialogue and conversation, because we're talking just around the 46th anniversary of the Camp David Accords, when they went into effect and between Israel and Egypt, and the today between Sisi and Netanyahu, I don't know of any conversation, only tension that's growing on Israel's southern border. And Israel needs Egypt, and Israel needs Egypt to play a robust, important role when it comes to Gaza, but also to maintain that highly strategic peace deal. But it also seems, to some extent, from my perspective, and I think Israel's still traumatized, obviously, by October 7th, but that we're not necessarily taking that into consideration. We're not taking what the Arabs need at the moment. We need to defend ourselves, so we're taking over a buffer zone in Syria. We were supposed to have pulled out of Lebanon. We're not yet pulling out of Lebanon. We're doing a lot of things that are very defense and security oriented, and I don't know if maybe politically motivated also, but we do need to maybe understand what are the Arab needs. Like what could those be, for example?
I'd be less concerned about Lebanon and Syria, and I don't know exactly what the Arabs feel about that, but I don't think they have an issue with that. I think for them, it's all very bad when things like this happen. They're busy building beautiful cities, thriving societies. They want to continue to build up their wealth. The last thing they want is trouble in the region, including in Lebanon and Syria. But I think they do need to figure out, they need for their own people, the Arab Street is a real thing, right? They need to figure out for their own people how they can properly help Palestinians, even if it's not the Palestinian state that everybody has promised the Palestinians for decades. But they don't like to see on their TV screens what has happened in Gaza, whether it's justified or not. And you and I share the same view on why Israel had to do what it did, why it now has to go back in. And even though they don't want to see the kind of things that happened on October 7, and many of them have said that publicly, they also don't like to see the destruction in Gaza. And I think Israel, again, if I could offer advice, needs to better explain to the right people there, the top leadership, if they're willing to listen, why Israel did what it did, what Israel's goals are, your question about what does a day after look like, that's realistically achievable with the partnership of the Arabs. Because if Israel demands things that the Arabs can't help, the U.S. isn't going to do it without the Arabs, so you're nowhere. Sit down and figure out what could we agree to together.
I want to shift gears for a moment and talk about the Abraham Accords, but more how they have weathered this war. I don't know that a lot of people know. I know definitely you know this, but there are 12 flights a day. Maybe I'm off by one or two between Israel and the UAE. While United just resumed flights after months of not flying. Delta has yet to fly. So the airlines of our greatest ally have not been flying for the last year pretty much. But the Emiratis, I think except for 1 or 2 days, one day in the beginning of the war, one day when Iran attacked us, I think that was the only time they might have stopped flying here. But they have been flying. It's not the same number of people going in either direction, but the fact is these flights do continue. And just that is an illustration, I think, of that relationship that continues. And I don't know that I would have necessarily assumed that after October 7th, that this would be the case. I don't know that we all could have assumed that none of the countries would say, hey guys, we gotta stop this, right? This is, we're ripping up the agreement or we're downgrading relations, but we haven't seen that. Maybe they're a little quieter. They're not as overt about the alliance right now, but it's still there. It's existing. There's still business. There's investments. There's diplomatic, political conversations with the Emiratis, with the Bahrainis, with the Moroccans. How do you explain that?
Let's start with the UAE. The UAE's leadership is serious. They made a strategic decision back when they signed the Abraham Accords that this is the way forward. It's the way forward for their people. It's the way forward for their country. It's the way forward for the entire Middle East. And they're not going to let bumps in the road, which of course they anticipated. They didn't anticipate October 7. Nobody really did, right? Apparently. But they anticipated bumps in the road, and they are eager to continue to develop the relationship. And yes, it is quieter. But I'm on those flights. If I have to go to the Middle East, and I travel there a lot, and I have to spend Shabbat there, I would try, if I can, to get to Israel. And I can. And it's, let's say if I'm coming from Riyadh, it's not quite as easy as coming from Dubai. But I remember in February when I handed in my passport at the Riyadh airport and the person who took it asked me where I was going. I said Abu Dhabi because, that was my next flight. He said, no, where's your ultimate destination? I said Israel. And the person's like, okay, and puts the luggage tags on and smiles and we move on. Everybody recognizes that this is the future. And I'll take it one more step. Despite what's going on, and it's terrible for everybody, the excitement in the air now about Lebanon and about Syria and the potential for business there down the road, not today. And we have to see what happens with Jolani because we don't really know what he is. Is he still a terrorist, or is he a partial reformed terrorist, or is he really a reformer? And unfortunately, what happened there in the last 2 weeks suggests that maybe we're a bit too optimistic. But there are business people, very serious business people, talking about Syria and Lebanon in a way that I haven't heard even from before I went into the White House back in 2017.
I mean, it's interesting, and the fact is that I guess let's stay on the UAE for one moment. They continue to see, obviously there's the leadership, which is super important, but they continue to see the value in the relationship despite the fact that this war continues, right? It's what is the value for them?
The value is this is what the Middle East needs to be for everybody to thrive, right? If you look at whether it's Vision 2030 in Saudi or UAE is doing a tremendous amount of change, Qatar is doing, they're all doing it, right? None of that is safe or even investable. And actually, I think Steve touched on this in some interview I heard, it might have been the Tucker interview, for them to actually become investable and really thrive and prosper and be safe, they need to solve as many of these problems as possible. I don't think anybody truly believes that Hamas or Hamas 2.0 or Hezbollah or Houthis or what the Iranian regime stands for is going to disappear permanently. It won't. There's always going to be ideologically driven evil people in the world, and certainly in the Middle East. But the more they could tighten that and quash it and catch it and prevent it, which doing it with Israel only helps the success rate, not just because Israel has tremendous technology and unfortunately tremendous experience with it, but you need smart partners who know what you're doing. I think that's one big driver. Economically, listen, Saudi's going to be fine without Israel, right? They're tremendously wealthy, and yes, they can get some great technology out of Israel, and they could do some really great business together, and they'd get along great. But at the end of the day, they can replace a lot of what Israel might offer them with other countries around the world, whether it's China, the U.S., India, you name it. But that still leaves open the question of too much tension in the region. So I think what drives everybody is they really believe in the future that the Abraham Accords was sort of premised upon. In fact, if you go back to President Trump's speech when he went in 2017, I think it was May of 2017, to Saudi Arabia, and he stood in front of all the Arab leaders that were there, most of them were there, Muslim and Arab leaders, talking about driving the terrorists out, talking about young people being able to live freely and praying that he wasn't there to tell them how to live, but if they wanted to live in a free, prosperous society, this was the way to do it. I think all of that kind of led into the Abraham Accords, and the Abraham Accords now leads into the continued cooperation despite October 7 and the aftermath of October 7.
You mentioned Lebanon, and I've been hearing also from Israelis and even Americans as well, who that they see there's opportunity there, right? Al-Jolani, Ashara, whatever name he goes by right now, totally agree. I think there was maybe premature acceptance of him and his government. People were taken in by the charm offensive. You had his foreign minister, Shobani, who went to Davos at the World Economic Forum, sat on stage with Tony Blair and spoke about women's rights and freedom of speech and whatever. And everyone's like, wow, this is the new Syria. And then we, of course, saw, as you mentioned, what happened with the Alawites just a couple of weeks ago. So it's you don't convert from Al-Qaeda to good guy that quickly. But with Lebanon, you do have a government with the president and the prime minister that really is taking a tougher stance on Hezbollah, on Iran, saying to the Iranians, stop meddling in our country. And you have a U.S. administration that's thinking, that is making moves to get involved there. There's reports of negotiations that are going to begin between Israel and Lebanon over the land border, similar to what happened with the maritime border in the Bennett-Lapid government period in 2022. Are you optimistic about Lebanon? Do you think that's something that's really attainable in the coming years? Or is Hezbollah, just the fact that they still exist there, it just won't happen?
No, I am optimistic for a couple of reasons. First of all, I didn't deal with Lebanon a lot, certainly not at the White House. And then, my first, let's say, meaningful interaction was with a Lebanese reporter. And during COVID, I was in Dubai. We had a great dinner. A news media organization hosted us. They were watching the back and forth with us, and they asked to take a picture. And this reporter said, no, if I take a picture with Jason Greenblatt, when I go back to Lebanon, they're going to kill me. Today, most of my clients have a lot of Lebanese working for them. And they remind me so much of Israelis, right? They are energetic. They are, I'll use the word aggressive, but I don't mean it in a bad way. I mean it like they're going to go get that business or whatever it is. They're nice. They're funny. They're just like, as a whole, Muslim, Christian, doesn't matter. It's really interesting, the similarities. I was on a call today with an Israeli company and a Lebanese company, and watching them negotiate with each other. I actually sent the client, in my case was Lebanese, not from Lebanon. And I said, it's funny watching you negotiate with your cousin. Like you're really the same, right? So I'm very, very optimistic. Israel has done such an amazing job with Hezbollah. And yes, they're there, but it's different than how Hamas is there. Mm-hmm. Hezbollah doesn't want to destroy Israel, even though they hate Israel and they're supporting Palestinians. And they had all these rockets to try to destroy Israel. It's a different psychology. And I think the seriousness of the leadership is going to be tested now. Are you willing to, I don't want to say crush Hezbollah because they're not going to be able to do that, or maybe they're not willing. But the more they box them in, I think the more Lebanon could thrive. And then you have that gas deal that the Biden administration managed to pull off. And I know there was criticism. Fine, it's done. Whether you're right in criticizing or not, that's the key to Lebanon's finally getting out of its economic suffering.
Yeah. And its dependence on the Iranians to an extent also. Right.
Yeah.
The other thing that this kind of ties into is how Iran is in a weak position today, weaker than it was ever before, a result of, I would say, three pieces to the puzzle. One is the proxies that have all been degraded to a great extent, so that belt of fire around Israel no longer really in place. The second is Israel destroying surface-to-air missile systems, the S-300, so making them more exposed, their critical infrastructure. And the third is Donald Trump in office and cracking down or cracking the whip when it comes to Iran. You know the president, you know Israel's prime minister, you've spent a lot of time with both of these men. I'll ask you like this. I mean, on the one hand, people would say, okay, is Donald Trump going to take military action against Iran? I think we kind of know that he first wants a deal with that he's made obvious. But where I'm a little concerned, and this is where I want to go with you, is I think that it's over Iran that we could have maybe not an explosion, but a rift between Israel and the Trump administration. This is the issue. And it could happen if Trump goes for a deal that Israel says this is a bad deal. How do you view this dynamic?
So first, I just want to add a fourth point to the three that you mentioned, which is Iran tried a very, very rough act upon Israel with all those missiles, right? And failed.
Yes.
We shouldn't take a victory lap. Maybe they have other stuff in store. And, I believe it was a miracle from God and a lot of technology from Israel and the United States and even countries like Jordan helping and all that. But are they more of a paper tiger than people think other than the nuclear? We don't really know. I don't think there will be a rift. I don't know that Bibi and Trump will see completely eye to eye on it as they get deeper into the details. And if and to the extent the Iranians maybe start talking to President Trump, and maybe they are somewhat serious, but not really. But I would agree with you that we have to watch that one closely, because as much as President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu do think alike on Iran, and President Trump doesn't just think that Iran, the Iranian regime, is an Israel problem or even an Israel GCC problem. He knows it's also a problem for the United States, whether our assets abroad and even potentially in the United States. So there, I think he'll be aligned with Bibi, but Bibi would probably want to rip apart anything, any shred of nuclear activity in Iran. And I think President Trump, if he could avoid that without escalating something big, would look over more stones than Bibi to be able to do that.
Yeah. And by the way, what was really interesting was the readout from the White House of the conversation, I think last week, between President Trump and President Putin of Russia, where beyond talking about ceasefire with Ukraine, it also mentioned how the leaders spoke about the Middle East and how they could cooperate there to keep things simmering down, and how Iran cannot be allowed to be a threat to the state of Israel. Now, what does this have to do with Russia, Ukraine? But clearly, there's a lot at play here. I want to finish up, though, maybe with some optimism, and that is Saudi Arabia. There was a lot of talk, obviously, before October 7, that a deal with the Saudis was close, was possible. There were a lot of people here in Israel who were pushing it. I'm sure you know these same people who thought that it could happen. It should happen under Biden, because Biden would be able to carry the Senate. The Republicans would be easy. You would need 2/3 to get the special defense pact that the Saudis want from America. The Republicans would be easy. The Democrats would be hard. Now to do that under Trump would be more difficult to get the Democrats. But my question is, Jason, what do the Saudis need from us? And what can we give them? And does it have to be a commitment to a two-state solution, excuse me, which I think we both know ain't going to happen right now from this government?
Right. Look, it's the wrong time to discuss whether it's two-state solution or something close to that. But unfortunately, if you watch the trajectory of the Saudi comments from the leadership on down, pre-October 7 and after October 7, you went from this great interview that the Crown Prince MBS did on Fox News with Brett Baer.
Yeah.
If your people haven't watched it, they should absolutely watch it. Where I don't want to say he ignored the Palestinians. He certainly didn't, but he spoke like Trump speaks, like we used to speak, about giving the Palestinians better lives. And we'll figure out what that means at the right time if we get good Palestinian leadership that could actually talk and negotiate appropriately. But they've hardened their position tremendously, and it's very much, depending on who's actually saying it, irreversible, real path to a two-state solution. And I would have, if I was advising MBS, I would have lightened some of those words a little bit because they were more concrete than I think was necessary. But people used to say that the Saudis don't care about the Palestinians. It's not true, right? Everybody in that region cares about the Palestinians. Do they care for their own interests versus really Palestinians? Depends on the country, depends on the leader, depends on the people. But we can't pretend anymore this idea that, we could give up on the Palestinians because nobody cares about them. They do care about them, and October 7 only made that caring even more real, not just because of what they view as what's happening in Gaza as tremendous suffering and unfair of Israel to do, but also because it does come back home to them one way or the other. So they have to figure out how to do it. And I still think that President Trump, in a little less than 4 years, I do want to end on an optimistic note. I think because of what's happened in this most recent period, and because people are tired, use the word simmering. People are tired in the region of simmering. They don't want just to keep things quiet and less noisy. They actually want to eliminate it as much as possible and bring more things to the fore. I think the opportunity for the Prime Minister at the right time and President Trump, if they could figure out the right formula for this, for the Saudis, not just from Israel and for the Palestinians, but also for the United States, right? I think this defense treaty, my guess is under Trump is going to be tougher than under Biden. You could just look at what's happening in Ukraine. President Trump is saying, hey, Europeans, it's your problem. And I agree with that. Maybe Trump will say, I'll back you up, I'll this, I'll that, but it's not his problem. So President Trump might say the same thing to the Saudis, but they have a great relationship. President Trump really respects the kingdom and MBS and vice versa. And they could talk the same language, that honest, not fake diplomatic talk, but, a word your audience probably knows, tachlis, right? Real serious, let's get down to business talk.
And it would be a huge win for everyone. I mean, definitely for Israel. I think that this, if they're smart, they connect it also to the end of the war. And this is a win that then Bibi would be able to sell to his constituents and to his coalition, potentially.
100%. If I could add just one thing, the biggest losers of the Abraham Accords were the Palestinians, right? If they had signed on and not criticized it, they could have actually been part of all this business, even if they didn't get their state or whatever it is they might get at the end of the day, even if they still were technically, I don't want to use the word at war, but in a conflict with Israel, they still could have taken advantage of the Abraham Accords, and they still can, by the way.
Yeah. Well, Jason Greenblatt, thank you so much for joining us. Really, your insights are hugely important and very interesting for people to learn from. So thank you.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us on today's episode. You can find us, as always, where podcasts can be found on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and the website of Times of Israel. Wishing you all Shabbat Shalom. And again, feel free to write to me, yaakovkatz@gmail.com. One word, just my name. Happy to hear your thoughts, suggestions, and where you think we should be, what you think we should be discussing.